You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 38. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the podcast. It is such a treat to have you here this week, and I'm so excited to introduce you to our very special guest, Lori Mihalich-Levin. Before I do that, I just wanted to say this is an episode that is really dedicated to the working parent. And whether you're at the very beginning and you're just getting used to dropping your kids off at daycare, or you are somewhere a few years in, maybe you've got more than one child, you're learning how to navigate that transition from one little human to two, or if you're a few years into it and you've been doing this for a while and you've been navigating the challenges of the pandemic, the tension between balancing your professional work and your family, all those things. This episode really speaks to those issues, and I would invite you to listen to it and take from it what is most helpful to you. And if you know anybody who is in this situation where they are navigating the challenges of working and doing the family thing and figuring out how to do it in a way that aligns most with their values, then I would encourage you to send this episode to them and invite them to have a listen. You never know. It may be that there's a message in here that is exactly what they need to hear right now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the recording of our interview and wish all of you a most amazing week. Bye for now. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited for all of you to join me here this week. I have a very special guest for all of you to meet. We are so excited. I'm so excited to have her here today. Her name is Lori Mihalich-Levin, and Lori is a lawyer and the founder of Mindful Return, and you're going to learn all about Mindful Return and what it is. She's also the author of Back to Work After Baby, and as you may have guessed, her area of expertise is really in helping new parents transition into the workplace. So, Lori, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on today.
It's so wonderful to be here with you, Paula. Thanks for having me.
It's so exciting. So, Lori, can you please tell us more about yourself?
Sure. So I'm joining you this morning from chilly Washington, D.C. I know chilly is a different definition in Canada, but it's 33 here. It was 20 something this morning, and that's cold for us. I like to say that I wear three main hats in life, although I know we all wear 72,000 hats every day.
Pretty much.
Yeah. My one hat is that I am mom to two wonderful redheaded boys who are just about 9 and 11. So they're in 3rd and 5th grade. They are blissfully in school today, which has not always been the case. As I'm sure you know, over the past couple of years, we had 15 straight months at home with them during the pandemic. So that was a very long haul. Professionally, I have two other hats. One is that I am a healthcare regulatory lawyer. I've done stints as an associate at a law firm. I went in-house for a while, and I've been a partner at a law firm where I was a partner on a 60% and then a 50% schedule. And I run a program called Mindful Return. That's my third hat, which I founded 8 years ago to help new parents transition back to work after parental leave. And I left my big law job last summer to focus more on Mindful Return. And now I practice law as my side gig. So I've flipped the weight of those things a bit. But I have very much appreciated and enjoyed having what I've called a portfolio approach to my career, where I'm not just doing one thing, and it keeps me more engaged and more happy.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lori. I love that. I heard the term multi-hyphenated the other day, which I think is another way of describing it, or multi-passionate. And I really love how you have these different hats, right? There's the hat as mother of your two boys, 9 and 11, which we were just talking about before we started recording. I love that you're 2 years ahead of me. So I get to look to you and say, okay, this is what the future can look like. Bravo. 15 months of having your children at home. I'm sure that you've learned.
Not pretty.
I can't even imagine, but I imagine you have so many pearls of wisdom that you can share with us after having gone through that experience. It's a real one for a number of parents in Canada as well, depending on where you are and what your schools are doing. And I think for all of us too, who are lawyers who have, sorry, you described it as sort of this portfolio, but interests and professional interests in addition to lawyering, which I think is so fascinating I think it's fascinating. I know a number of our listeners are going to be really interested to hear about how you have, how you balance those and how the interests that you've had have shaped the trajectory of your career. So thank you so much, lawyers. So excited to have you. One of the things that I imagine you hear a lot of is the challenges that parents face in relation to balancing their responsibilities as parents and balancing their responsibilities as professionals. And you work with parents, as I gather, the mindful return. So in those initial stages when they first go back to work after baby number one. And I imagine
or two, or three, or four.
Or three.
Yes.
Beautiful. And how the challenges evolve over time. I mean, imagine the experience that you had when you first went back versus the challenge of last year, 15 months of pandemic schooling. They change. So I would love to hear from you what some of the common challenges are that you hear from parents at the various stages of balancing their professional and their family lives.
Yeah, that's a great question. I could go in so many different directions, and I'll put a pin in the word balance, and we can talk about that later because it's not my favorite word. But in terms of the stages, I guess the first thing I'll say is that when I first founded Mindful Return, I thought that the program would be most useful to first-time around parents, just as you were implying. And it turns out 8 years down the road that about half of each of our cohorts is full of existing parents, as I call them, who have second, third, fourth, children. And I ask why is that? And it's because people who didn't necessarily have a very positive transition back to work after parental leave the first time want to have a do-over. They want to have a community of support behind them. They want to have strategies. And as you're suggesting, baby number two is different, right? It presents different challenges than the first one. So I think every parent transitioning back to work after any child probably needs a little bit of support and guidance. That said, when someone's going back to work after baby number one, I think some of the biggest challenges I see are around navigating that transition into childcare, trusting the care provider, feeling really weird about leaving that being that you've just created with some other human. And I recall that not being an issue at all with baby number two, because I had already formed really trusted relationships with the care provider. I mean, I think in the baby stages, the sleeplessness and sleep deprivation is always challenging. And as you're suggesting, some of those feelings of guilt at the beginning. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm being a quote unquote good mom to my baby if I'm going to work. And I don't know if I'm being a quote unquote good employee. I think those can be really severe at the beginning, those thoughts. And the identity shift and transition is really hard at the beginning for the new parent, right? I mean, you've been so-and-so the professional, so-and-so the lawyer who had mastering control over her world and her career and travel and all of that good stuff. And then suddenly you're confronted with this task of caring for this being, and you have no idea how to do it. And you don't know if you're doing it right or wrong. And there's a whole bookshelf of books that give you, conflicting opinions on what you should be doing. And so I really think that the identity shift into working parenthood is big, right? Initially. Over time, we get through the challenges of the petri dishes that are daycare and the different, illnesses that come with that and the unexpected that comes with that. I think that the adage, the problems get fewer but larger, might be true. When a baby is born, they have like 25 things in an hour that you don't know what's happening. Now my sons are, 9 and 11, and they don't have hourly problems. But the issues that they have are more significant, right? They're around mental health and forming friendships and how to deal with, a math problem that they're not understanding and all those sorts of things that you don't deal with when the kids are really little. So, we've gone from fights over daycare spots and wait lists for pre-K to now being completely assured that our children are going to public school. So we don't have that as a navigating challenge anymore. But now we have to fill our summers with summer camps that are very expensive and school doesn't last all year and it ends at 3 p.m. And I don't know, I could go on and on, but those are sort of a smattering of the different stages that we're going through. And now, I have an 11-year-old, we're in puberty. So that's a whole nother can of worms.
Oh, wow. I can't even imagine, although it's getting close. And Lori, I love how you've described that because I can see how you would have more, or not more, but you would have parents that are coming to you after their first children. And I'd like to ask you as well about your experience with your second child. I know when I went back the first time, it was so much of that identity shift that you were describing, right? Where you've gone from being the lawyer who is able to put work at the top of the priority list, no problem. And then when the new person comes along, the baby's there, your responsibilities really change. Your priorities, they necessarily shift. Somebody has to be there to pick up the child from daycare or they're going to call the authorities. Like, this is not really an option to stay late and finish whatever it is that you would like to finish. And so there's a lot of that identity shift at the beginning. And then having another child. So I've got 2 children. I found with the second child that it added an extra layer to that where there's increased exhaustion. I found because there were the sleepless nights with the baby, but also then managing the first child. I mean, I remember feeling that way during pregnancy, right? The first pregnancy was a walk in the park. It wasn't, but by comparison,
yes.
It was, because if you needed to rest, you could rest. But when you've got a toddler and you're pregnant, all of a sudden you're not able to get that extra sleep. And it's like that when you go back to the office, or that's what I found is that it was, I think you described it. I was listening to a podcast you'd done. It's like going from like 2 children to 85 children.
Yes, like 1 plus 1 is 85 is what we say in our household.
That's how it feels. And you're still balancing that with your responsibilities at the office. So the transitions, they play out differently. And then, as you talked about, as the children get older, then the problems or the challenges that you have are so different. And, in our house, for example, it's screen time and, are we eating a healthy enough diet? And what about all this sugar that keeps creeping in? And, are we getting enough time outside? And of course, with the pandemic, it's put pressure on the ability to have play dates and extracurricular activities. And so there's these constant questions that come up as parents is, are we doing enough? And then of course, on the flip side, are we doing enough at work as well? So I imagine you see all of it.
Yes. And that word enough is a fraught one. I mean, I feel like in the legal billable hour world, there is no such thing as enough. Like every month, it's a new month. It's a fresh slate of hours needed to be accrued. And, I have a personal sort of daily practice around enoughness because I think it's something we have to create for ourselves because to the outside world, nothing will ever be enough. I mean, we can never meet everyone's expectations, period.
Totally. And do you have any recommendations on that? I mean, I've got clients who I've worked with who are lawyers, they're high performing, they're in firms where billable hours are part of their output. That is part of what's being measured. Do you have any recommendations in terms of how you approach that question from the perspective of balancing the, because that's the thing with billable hours, right? It's a unit of time.
Yes. So I'll tell you what I have done in the past, Paula, and then people can take or leave this strategy because I recognize that it has pitfalls. There are 2 prongs. The first one I think is non-controversial. The second one might be controversial. The first one is to really ground and center in my own values and to use the Teddy Roosevelt quote, comparison is the thief of joy, to really just focus on me and what I need for my family and know what is most important in my life so that the value that I am placing on the billable hour as it relates to my identity goes down. The second strategy that I used for a long time when I was a partner at Denton's was to not look at my hours. And that, as I said, can have good and bad consequences because then you might not know where you're stacking up or whatever. But when the monthly hours reports came around, I didn't open them. And I did that for my own sanity and mental relief because I didn't want to know how I was stacking up against my peers because that wasn't how I was valuing or rating myself. So, I worked hard. I put in the hours that I needed to work to get the work done. And then I just decided to let it go.
It's amazing. It's really an interesting way to approach the billable hour. One of the things that is different for me as an entrepreneur versus when I was practicing is I no longer record billable hours. And so what I measure for myself is value. Where am I contributing value? And that really is looking at the output and the deliverables and, are the people that I'm working with satisfied? Have they gotten the result that I want them to achieve?
Yeah.
And so what I love about your approach, controversial as it may be to some, I don't know, is that it allows you to focus more on, am I delivering the results? Am I creating the value? And less so on, am I, docketing the 0.1s and the 0.2s,
Yeah.
which in itself, I think, the billable hours, it is what it is, right? It's a placeholder. It's a way of measuring time and value. I mean, it's not a perfect measure. We all know that, but it really does take the shift off, and they're so different, right? I used to litigate, and there's, the hour you're sitting in chambers waiting, you're not delivering as much value as, the 0.25 that you're actually on your feet speaking to your application. So that time isn't always a measure of value. And what's neat about your approach from my perspective is that you really are capturing the value, right? You're focused on the provision of the services that get the results that you need, and without looking so much at the numbers. So I love that. It's very refreshing.
Thank you. I have 2 notes that I would like to add to that.
Yeah.
Just reflecting a little bit. One is, one of the reasons I was able to quote unquote get away with that, and no one kicked me out for the duration that I was a partner. I think I was a partner for about 6 years, was that a lot of my work was not hours based, right? So I would land agreements with clients where it was a global agreement. It was a flat fee over a certain period of time, which I found to be much more comfortable. So, I had the revenue coming in, but I didn't have to worry about exactly how many hours were being racked up against it. And the other thing I want to point out, and we can just commiserate about, is that I think working parents are some of the most efficient people on the face of the earth. And, when you become more efficient in a billable hour world, you bill fewer hours. And so I sort of think that the system is rigged against those of us who become very oriented toward getting something done, as opposed to people who sort of drag out projects, not because they necessarily intend to, but because they have all the time to drag them out. And so I think it's a challenging position to be in, to be becoming more and more efficient and able to prioritize and even better at your job, and have it appear as though you are now worse at your job because you're billing fewer hours. It's a conundrum.
And I love that you said that, Lori, and I love that you mentioned an alternative fee structure, and that, and I agree. I don't think I was ever as efficient, or I never had to be as efficient as I have become since having children, because your time is now, there are real bookends to the day. There's the mornings with the kids, there's the evenings with the children, and wanting to be efficient with the time that you have. And for a lot of listeners, they may have flexibility in terms of how they show their value. I mean, it'll be different. I mean, for some listeners, they have their own firm and they're setting their own fee structures, and so they're able to capitalize on the efficiencies. For others who are in a large firm, like the one that you were in, for example, maybe that means figuring out how to structure the fees differently with their clients so that they're not being penalized for being efficient. So
exactly.
I think I love that you suggested that, and that you mentioned that, just because these are options for women who want to show, I'm still contributing. It might not be because I'm recording X number of hours, but here's the value that I'm bringing. And so I love knowing that there's options out there. I have another question for you, Lori, which is, what impact having children typically has on working parents in terms of their priorities?
Well, I think having children automatically puts in the front of your mind what your priorities are and forces you to articulate them out loud in a way that you might not have otherwise been called to do. I think your priorities, for me anyway, my priorities had to get calendared in a way that they previously didn't. If something did not appear on the calendar, then it just simply didn't happen. Ambition and work and career development are still, for me, just as high on the list as they were before I had children. And being an available and compassionate mother to my children is also high on the list. And so for me, it's about integrating those two into a week rather than causing them to be in conflict with one another. My husband and I, maybe 7 years ago or so, started a practice of having a Saturday evening meeting, hot date on the couch, where we sort of go through a whole number of things. It started with this thing that we call the Saturday basket, where we toss all of the things that need to be addressed into the basket. And Saturday night, we deal with it and map out our week. And we found that, over time, we learned that our own mental health suffered dramatically when we didn't one, have time with our own grown-up friends when we didn't have time for ourselves, et cetera. And so now at that Saturday meeting, we block on the calendar the priorities that we have, like going on a date night for the two of us, like scheduling time alone. Like I get a 3-hour chunk on Saturdays and he gets a 3-hour chunk on Sundays. And, that's something that we intentionally put on the calendar. So I think having children forced us to articulate the priorities and then find a home for them on the calendar. It's not that necessarily any of our priorities from before went out the window, but they just got modulated in terms of how much time we can spend on them and how they fit into a work week.
I think it's so fascinating. I love your idea of a hot Saturday date night. I heard you mention this before and I was like, oh, that is such a good idea. And the idea of a basket. So we may start implementing the same thing at our house, because what a wonderful way to manage your weekend, to give that focus to what it is that you want to have happen. Because absolutely, I'm with you. If it doesn't get calendared, it doesn't happen. And I would like to know that the things that are important are going to happen in our lives. One of the things that I found for myself when I had children was that my focus in terms of my professional work shifted. And so you mentioned that, your professional work is really important to you, that your career ambitions are really important, and that you're balancing those with your family. And what I find interesting is that your commitment to mindful return seems to be increasingly taking up more space in your professional work. And so I'd love to know how that shift has happened for you over time, and how that is a reflection of the priorities that you have.
Yeah, that's a great question. I started Mindful Return as a passion project. It was 20 minutes here and there. Like, oh my gosh, somebody has to create this thing because people aren't providing this type of support. There are so many baby-focused resources, but not grown-up focused resources. And it was, that evening and weekend, wherever I could squeeze in the time thing. I made a very intentional shift after about a year and a half of running Mindful Return and seeing just how much benefit this community and this program were having on people, that I wanted to have some daylight hours to actually work on it and not just shove it into my post-bedtime routine. So that's when I ended up leaving the trade association where I was working when I had my 2 kids and going, ironically, back into a firm, which I sort of at one point swore I would never do, and was definitely a lesson in never say never. And, I interviewed at firms with the premise that I would only be on a 60% schedule, and basically said, whoever wants me at 60%, you can have me if you want more of me. I'm sorry, that's not what's available right now. And, there were any number of firms that did want to hire someone on a 60% schedule. And my interest in, one, supporting working parents at the firm, and also 2, serving as an alternative model for people at the firm was really important to me. That it's okay to be on an alternative schedule, and this is normalized, and here's why I'm doing it. And then, over time, a couple of reasons why my emphasis on mindful return has shifted. One, my passion for it has absolutely grown. And I think during the pandemic, especially, I saw that working parents were just completely underwater and, just struggling mightily. And so my attention was really drawn to trying to help that effort even more. And 2, mindful return is a parental leave benefit, a learning and development option. And there are now 85 different companies, about half of them are law firms, that are offering mindful return as a parental leave benefit. And so I'm, more in a position of having a viable business model where, there are companies that are paying to send employees through the program. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that we took a survey of about 1,000 of the people who had been through the mindful return program and looked at a 5-year period of time, and discovered that in contrast to the 64% return rate that is, the average return rate in the US anyway, of women who go back to work after having a baby, the people who had taken mindful return, 85% of them were still at their same employer and 93% were still in the workforce. And it's data like that that say to me, oh my gosh, this program actually helps with retention. It's doing what I hoped it would do. And I want to devote more time to it because I'm so passionate about it. Yes, I care about my Medicare legal practice and believe that supporting physicians in residency programs is important. That's my, legal gig. And it doesn't get me fired up as much as trying to support fellow working moms and working parents in the workplace.
which is so amazing. Like I can see, I mean, for the benefit of our listeners, I get to see Lori. We're having a face-to-face Zoom conversation, and I can see how excited you are and how passionate you are about the project and about the work. And those are amazing numbers, right? To have that kind of impact on a community of parents who clearly feel supported. There's clearly something going on there for them, and to have that connection to them, have that connection. And, from what I understand, this comes out of your own experience, right? It's like, what would I have benefited from in this period of transition? And now you're able to create that for others so that they're feeling whatever it was that you would have wanted in those transitions. So what do you think it is about the program? Is it the structuring? Is it the community? Is it like, what do you think is so effective at helping people through those transitions?
Yeah. So I think there are two questions baked in there. One is what's helpful in retaining an employee, and then what's helpful in having people actually feel supported. Yeah. And they're interrelated, but not exactly the same. I've had people who have not even spent all that much time in the course material say, I feel really grateful to my employer for giving me this tool to help me come back. It says that they care about me and that they actually want me to return after I have a baby. And that matters, Yeah. So I think just like the statement of offering support from an employer really matters. But I think the secret sauce inside of the Mindful Return course, which is a 4-week online asynchronous course, but it's run as a cohort. So you're in there with other people who are all at the same life stage as you, and you're interacting with them. The secret sauce really is that community. It's that sense of hearing someone else articulate so beautifully the exact fears and concerns that you have, and having you say, oh my gosh, I'm not crazy. That's what went through my head. And that we're all feeling these things and we're all hearing them and echoing them. So, I mean, I like to think that the course material itself is high quality and very supportive. And I know that 50%, if not more, of the value of taking this program is being in a cohort with people who are all driven professionals who want to figure out how to do this balance, if we're going to use that word, and hearing the idea that they're just not alone and that other people have gone through it and have figured it out, and so can they.
Absolutely. I love that, Lori. And I think what you're doing is such an amazing service, because it's true. I think you're creating the framework, you're creating the content and the materials, and here's what's helpful. And here's an opportunity to meet with other individuals who are just like you, who are having the same challenges. I know I'm part of membership communities where there is that energy, and there's something that is so validating about hearing other people articulate the same challenges that you're going through. I think as parents, what is particularly interesting in that dynamic is that we all live our separate lives with our separate families, and we see other people's outsides, right? We see their Facebook reels, we see whatever things show up on social media, and we start comparing our insides to their outsides, right? Like our days where everything is a mess and the kids are fighting, and, you give them, I don't know, Eggo waffles and take whatever it happens to be. And, we can fall into these spirals where we feel like we're bad moms, bad parents, that we're not doing enough, going back to the word enough. And then, but the reality is that we're all kind of living out our existences within our separate homes, and we're all facing similar challenges. And maybe we're not facing them all at the same, luckily we're not all facing all challenges at the same time. They, spread themselves out so we have a chance to catch our breath and everything. But to be able to see that, the standards are actually, we don't need to impose these unrealistic standards on ourselves, that we can we can embrace the fact that we're all human, that we're all going to have challenges, we're all going to have successes, and that there's other people out there that are just like us. And I think that can be such an empowering community to have, and to feel like you're supported and you're validated, and that there are people out there that understand what you're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess 2 other thoughts came to mind as to what I think makes the program effective. One is in the jumble of emotions and tasks and sort of chaos that is new parenthood, people appreciate having something structured to work through. Like, okay, you just told me that there are 4 categories that I need to get my head around. Okay, I can do that. And the other thing that I hear from people is, you've given me something to check off every day. Like, I can read this short thing. I can interact with my peers and they get super vulnerable. And then I can check it off. And guess what? It gives me a little dopamine hit to check it off. And I don't get to really check off much of anything when, I'm just trying to nurse for the 13th time today and keep my baby alive. So there's some element of the type A craving order that I think benefits from this type of program too.
Absolutely. And you've pre-digested it. And that dopamine hit counts for something. I remember when my kids were super young and I was in the grocery store lineup and a woman complimented me on something that I had done. I think I told my children they weren't allowed to have, I don't know, a toy or a candy or this or whatever. And most of the time you do these acts as a parent that you think are in the best interest of your children. And people just, your kids yell at you and nobody really says good job. But anytime somebody gives you that pat on the back, like, good job, mom, like you're, good for you, it gives you that extra, maybe it's the dopamine, but it's that lift you need to just take that next step forward and keep going. So I love that you've created a community where parents can find that. Lori, you mentioned, oh my gosh, I cannot believe 15 months of I gather this was homeschooling. Is that what it, or homeschool, whatever.
Remote school.
Remote school.
Remote
it's
school.
Not technically homeschooling. I know for so many parents, I feel so blessed. In where I live, we've had school most of the time. There were a couple of months where the schools in our neighborhood were closed down. But apart from that, we've had our children physically go to school. And there are parts of Canada where it has not been like that, where the schools have been shut down and, the parents have been doing the remote learning. And I know for myself, when the children have been at home and I've been working, it creates this real conflict because for whatever reason, as soon as I go to open my laptop and start working, that's when the children will want my attention for whatever reason. And they will go to great lengths sometimes to get it.
Yes.
And what it does for me is it puts me in this position of conflict, right? Where I really care about my family and I really care about my professional work. And now all of a sudden I'm sitting in front of my computer and I have to really face that conflict head on. And it is very challenging. And I know for parents who are doing what you've done, or I guess I don't know, but I'm guessing that conflict shows up more often because your children aren't off site. They're actually in the home. So what recommendations would you provide? What guidance, what advice would you offer to parents who, because I don't think that we're done with this quite yet, right? But what recommendations would you give to parents? What lessons did you draw from going through that experience with your children?
Yeah, great question. Pivot, 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 pivot. That was my word of every day. Like, know that every single day you're going to have absolutely no idea what is about to happen. And I think I just uttered that word throughout the day, almost as my mantra. My husband and I had a very jigsaw puzzle-like schedule between the two of us. So I think communication with a partner or with someone else who you are able to share some tasks with was absolutely critical in mapping out who was on point when, and then really acting as though that other parent weren't available. Yes, they might have wanted mommy, but guess what? Mommy is blocked off for these hours. We tried to keep up certain traditions and rituals that we would have done even if they had left the house. So for example, we have a separation ritual with our kids. It's called hug, kiss, push. It came into being when they were in daycare, when they were toddlers and they wouldn't separate themselves from our legs and they were like attached. And
remember those days.
Yeah. And so at some point when they were like, around 3 or 4, we came up with this hug, kiss, push thing where they're allowed one last squeezy hug, one last squeezy kiss, and then a push out the door, which was hilarious to them because normally they're not allowed to push mommy and daddy, and it detached them from our legs. They still do hug, kiss, push. They're like, 9 and 11. And so we made sure to adopt that in our house to make sure that they knew that, like, okay, hug, kiss, push means goodbye. And we separated from them even within the home. Another strategy really was just like looking only one day ahead. Like if we looked further, we would cry in agony at all that we weren't doing. And I think it was really a 15-month survival goal as opposed to, people are like, oh, thrive during quarantine. I was like, no. Survive during quarantine. Use whatever help and resources you can get. Our therapy bills were very high for many members of our family, and that was an essential. I started doing a one-on-one yoga session once a month with a teacher who used to live in DC and moved to Colorado. And now I could work with her remotely via Zoom and, really prioritizing that thing that filled me up. Yeah, I think survival mode probably. And recognizing that it won't always be like that. The last thing I'll say is, generally speaking, I do truly believe in the concept of work-life enrichment instead of work-life conflict. And this is a concept from the psychology literature. There's a wonderful researcher at Brown University named Yael Schonbrun, who has done a lot of research on work-life enrichment. And I try to center and focus on the idea that in general, even if not on this one particular COVID-filled day, my work does enrich my life and how I feel about my family and children. And I'm a better mom because I work and I have these other interests. And conversely, I am better at my career. I'm better at running my company, even at practicing law, because I am a parent and because parenthood forces me to stop and take time out of every day to be more present with my children. And so in the darker moments, I try to remember that they are actually supporting one another, even if in the moment they can feel like they're dragging the other one down.
Totally. I love how you've articulated that. And I've definitely felt that as well, that notion that the professional work that I do complements and enhances how I show up as a parent to my children. Mm-hmm. And conversely, that the enrichment that they bring into my life and mm-hmm. the choices I've made professionally because of them, right? Mm-hmm. Because of creating time for them, because I'm now interested in something because of them, that the two really do complement each other, mm-hmm. even though sometimes they are at odds with each other. And the thing that I have found is maybe the biggest challenge for me, and one that I am intentionally mindful of, is just time, right? That when the children are at home, it means I will not be necessarily moving as quickly as I would if they were not here, but that's okay, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I find just wrapping my head around that sometimes really helps. But I really love how you've highlighted that, right? That the two really do serve each other. And I love what you talked about with this yoga class. One of the things that I think is important is self-care. And kind of related to that is notion of setting boundaries, right? Boundaries for ourselves. And I would love to know what your thoughts are on boundaries, why they're important, and how you would recommend communicating boundaries.
Gosh, boundaries is such an important topic in working parenthood. It, elevates it to the top of the priority list right away. I'm a big fan of the image that I believe it's Greg McCowan draws about boundaries. He says, picture a playground where the kids are just running all over the place. And, the grownups are responsible for making sure that they don't run across the street or, go out and hurt themselves. And then imagine that you put a fence around it. Now the kids can play wherever they want. The grownups don't have to pay as much attention and worry about them. And everyone's freedom has effectively doubled by the fact that you have this boundary. And so I like to remind parents that boundaries are not this evil stick that we're wielding. They are necessary to everyone's freedom, and to think of it more as a freedom tool than as a bludgeon, I guess. In terms of setting and communicating boundaries, I think there are sort of a couple of steps that I think you need to go through in thinking about boundaries. One is, where do I need to put a boundary? How can I then implement the boundary? But then just as importantly, how can I reinforce the boundary? Because it's really only on me to be able to reset it. I was coaching a woman who is a lawyer at a big firm, and she was growing very frustrated because she had thought that she had established and appropriately articulated a boundary around bath and bedtime. And she had a partner who was consistently calling her at like 6:30 every night. And she said that she kept feeling bad for, she would either pick up or she would feel bad that she had to remind the partner. And I think in that instance, my advice is twofold. Either one, I think you can drop the narrative about the idea that they forgot because they don't care about you. It's just that this partner, that's his habit, right? And so if you drop the narrative that you did something wrong and that, oh my gosh, you have to remind him again, not just, nope, can't talk now, but I'll talk at 8:30, and remembering that part of the boundary setting process is that the boundary just needs to be reminded over and over. And that's part of the normal process. I think that can help. The other prong of this is, if that's not okay, there are other people you can work for who will respect the boundaries more. And we all have choices in terms of where we work and for whom we work. So it's a matter of, getting comfortable. But I keep coming back on boundary setting and meeting other people's expectations. I often come back to Laura Vanderkam's work around time management. She has this wonderful parable called Juliet's School of Possibilities. And in this book, she talks about the fact that even if you had all the time in the world, you just could not possibly meet everyone's expectations, and meeting the ones that hang on a second. I'm just going to grab it because she says it so much more beautifully than I do. Here's the thing. There can be infinite expectations. Even if you never slept, you cannot meet all the expectations of your employer, your colleagues, your clients, your friends, your family, yourself. You cannot do everything. The choice to meet one expectation is always a choice not to meet another. Then she goes on to say, expectations are infinite. Time is finite. You are always choosing. Choose well. So for me, putting a boundary in place is declaring my choice. It's saying, this is the thing out of the millions that I have chosen to focus on. I'm not going to allow the other things in right now. Yes, I can be flexible when I need to be under emergency circumstances, but otherwise I've made the choice. I know that my time is finite. This is what I'm choosing to focus on. And I will live with whatever the consequences of having that boundary. I'm going to pause there. I've gone in a lot of directions.
I love that. I love that quote too, because it's so true. There are infinite possibilities out there and infinite opportunities, and recognizing that it's a choice, right? That you are choosing this particular activity in the moment. You're making a decision to the exclusion of others. I think that's a really beautiful way of describing it. Quick question there on this notion of enforcing boundaries. And this came up in a coaching conversation I had the other day with a lawyer who was talking about, whether or not the environment they were in was one they wanted to stay in the long run. And boundaries was an issue, right? Having communicated a boundary and then feeling like that boundary wasn't necessarily respected, right? It was a workload question. And so what would you recommend there in terms of, if you work at an organization, for example, maybe it's a law firm, maybe it's something else, where you've made a request that you want, maybe it's fewer billable hours, or you don't want to be working weekends, whatever it looks like, and you feel like your employer hasn't really respected that. And my guess is that this isn't happening out of malice or the employer trying to impose something on the employee that they don't want. My guess is that it's busy and they're in survival mode and they need somebody to do the work. And so they're asking somebody to do the work. What recommendations or what ideas might you have for the person who maybe needs to or would benefit from, and I realize I'm kind of putting my own spin on it. Maybe they wouldn't benefit from it, but to reinforce or to reiterate the boundary, because it's almost like you have that conversation once and then you expect that the boundary will be respected, but maybe sometimes it doesn't catch that first time. What do you think about that? Like, have you had that experience where you're wanting to go back to that conversation and reassert the boundary?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that it's okay to reassert a boundary. It's also okay to say, yes, I said I could do that before and now I can't now because my circumstances have changed. I want to just put a plug in for a wonderful Instagram account. I don't know this woman personally, but Nedra Tawwab, Tawab, she does beautiful work on the exact language that you can use when talking about how to set boundaries in your personal life, with your relationships, with your employers. So just go follow her Instagram page for like actual language you can use on a regular basis. I think taking away any idea that boundary setting is a once and done conversation is probably helpful. Like it's an ongoing negotiation, on a periodic basis. Maybe it's even putting a calendar item on with the person that you are touching base with on a regular, every 3 weeks or something, to say like, let's touch base and reevaluate how this schedule is working out, or whether or not what we've agreed to is actually sticking, or even if it's a calendar note to yourself to check in on how it's working and to raise it. I think recognizing whether this is in fact a season, and a season that you were willing to work through and say, okay, like I get it. I'm going to have to work weekends for the next couple of months because there's this huge project and it's going to end in September. And we've all agreed that after that, it'll be fine, not it'll be fine, but I can deal with it until then. Or to say, this is chronic. I'm working for an organization where everyone is having these problems. Guess what? It is not just me. This is how the organization is built. And then deciding for yourself whether you want to work within that structure or not. I think some of us focus on the things that, and I'm guilty of this all the time, but focusing on my contribution and my responsibility to the problem, when in reality, it might be a bigger structural issue. It might be that the entire economic base of this organization is built on the billable hour. I don't know, or built on systemic sexism or racism or whatever. It might not be you is what I'm getting at. And if you can sort of evaluate what you have control over versus what you don't have control over, I think that can be helpful in figuring out whether to make a move or not.
I love that. Thank you so much, Lori, because I think you're absolutely right. There's the conversation. I'm going to check out that Instagram account. I'm always interested in elegant ways of articulating a boundary because it's not always easy. I love that. And I also love looking at the organization as a whole, right? Having made some efforts, some genuine efforts, having had some difficult conversations to carve out the boundaries that you want. If it's not working, sometimes that is beyond what one individual can do. And in that case, you're now making another decision about, are you going to choose that environment or choose one that is different?
Yeah.
So great. A couple more questions for you, Lori.
Sure.
I know you are highly efficient and productive, and I would love to know if you have any productivity hacks that you would be willing to share. I get all excited. I love this kind of thing.
I know. I love it too. And yet I don't know how much I have that's all that effective. I do a brain dump list making exercise every weekend where I take everything that's on the, in my head and put it out onto paper. I've just recently, as in like a week and a half, so it's still totally new, started trying out an app called Todoist, Todoist, which is basically trying to convert I'm going to, hold up my paper to-do list onto an electronic app version. And so far I'm enjoying it, but the verdict's still out because it's only been a week and a half. I'm a big fan of Daniel Pink's MIT principle, which is most important task. And he has a really short, Pink cast. It's a minute and a half about this. But the idea is to do the most important task first in a day. And that sounds sort of simple and not rocket science and maybe a little silly. And don't we do that anyway? And the answer is no, we actually don't. We often go through our to-do list and pick the easy things that give us the quick dopamine hits and don't necessarily address the most important things. And I found that as a working parent, knowing that I could wake up tomorrow and get my children to school and then in 30 minutes have to go pick them up, it's more important that I do the most important thing first because I might not have the rest of the day to work on it. So MIT is important. I love the Pomodoro Method, the 25-minute block of time where you're working undistracted and then you've got 5 minutes of break, where undistracted, I mean, all your technology is off and whatnot. And then productivity hack for me is scheduling downtime. It's the scheduling alone time. It's the ability to plug myself in and recharge by reading a novel and making sure I get 7 hours of sleep a night. And, addicted is a strong word, but I love Insight Timer. I use it every day and do a 15-minute yoga session every morning before breakfast. And for me, those are the things that make me more efficient, productive, and clear-headed.
I love it. Yeah, I share a number of your strategies. The brain dump weekly is one that I practice as well. I need to know what's coming up in my week. I like to be cognizant of what projects I have going on. I find it super helpful, especially when your days do get disrupted, to know already what you want to accomplish that week. And then you can shift the existing items as opposed to having to kind of come up with them from scratch. I really like that most important task first concept, especially if you don't know if you ever will have time to
do the second task.
Important tasks. So, and it sounds like you have practices and routines. And to me, that's always a big part of it is, are we making it a practice that we adhere to? So I love hearing your productivity tips. And I remember I read one of your, I think it was a blog article or something where you talked about the Pomodoro Method, and it reignited my interest in it. And I did a few Pomodoros that day or that week. And I was like, yeah, this is really awesome, right? It really does give you that focus for that period of time to get whatever it is that you're working on to get it done. And I think we have time for one last question, Lori, which is, we've alluded to it a couple of times already, the notion of work-life balance and what your take on that is.
So when I sit down and think about words, and, lawyers love to think about the meaning of words.
Definitely.
And concentric circles and what fits into what and Venn diagram. I'm like, why is the word work not part of the word life? Why are they two separate things that we're contrasting, right? And so when forced to discuss this, and I use the words work-life balance just because people know what that means, what the reference is.
Totally.
But I much prefer either work-life integration or, quite frankly, just the word life. Like, work is an important part of life. Like, I live, right? And therefore I work and I parent and I all these things, but just like putting them at odds to each other doesn't work for me. So I brought this up before, but where I really like to recenter myself is in the work-life enrichment argument that they're enriching each other. And I just sort of let go of the story that they're in conflict, and then I don't think about it. I also don't use the word busy. And I find that language really matters. And so when I don't think of myself as busy, I don't act with the panic that comes with busy. And when I don't use the word work-life balance, I don't think of myself as having them in conflict because I'm not sitting there trying to measure them against each other.
I love that. And I think it's so true. I think to me, work-life balance just brings up this concept of having to have, it's like pressure that you have to have a certain amount of time at work. I'm using air quotes, and a certain of time not at work. And the reality is that the two kind of ebb and flow, right? There's going to be times when you're spending more time with your family. There's going to be times where there's more time spent on your professional work. And it's that flow. It's not necessarily balance, right? Sometimes it's going to be completely off balance, and that's a good thing. You like it like that, right? It's fun, it's exciting. And so I totally agree. And interestingly, I love that you talk about definitions. Earlier today, I was looking at the definition of life. Just because, it's life, right? But what is the definition of life? There's the game of life. And so I wanted to know, like, how do people define life? And I won't bore you with the details, but one of the key pieces of it was growth. And I thought that was really interesting. So anyhow, a bit of an aside, but yes, I think looking at definitions and what the meaning that we give to words is pretty fun, and watching the words that we use, right? Like the word busy, I also try not to use that one. It's really hard to find a synonym though when you're like, oh, I'm really busy. You're like,
full. My life is full.
I'm
full in a good way.
All sorts of different options. So, Lori, with this podcast episode, there will be notes, show notes, and you've given us a number of resources already that we'll include. I would love to include information on how people can find you, how they can work with you. Where can they find you? What the Mindful Return, please tell us.
Sure. Thank you, Paula. They can go to www.mindfulreturn.com and find out about all of our programs. We have a new cohort for moms and a new cohort for dads starting every other month. I'm on all the usual social media channels. You can follow us on Instagram at Mindful Return, and Facebook and Twitter and all good places. LinkedIn. If you heard this podcast episode and you link in with me and say you heard this episode, I will accept your connection. I don't always accept every LinkedIn connection that comes my way, but if you mention the podcast, I will. I co-host a podcast myself called Parents at Work that you can feel free to check out. Oh, and when I say I co-host it with my wonderful husband, who's a career coach, and we just have a blast doing it together. And then the last thing is you can find my book, Back to Work After Baby, over on Amazon.
Amazing. Beautiful. And we will link to all those things. Lori, it has been such a pleasure having you here and having the chance to chat. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up today?
Oh, you are a wonderful interviewer. Thank you, Paula. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And I mean, like, working parents are in a tough spot after 2 years of a pandemic. So I just want to say, like, you got this. You'll figure out how to make it through. We are putting one foot in front of the other, and we're all just necessarily letting balls drop, and that's okay. We'll pick them up later.
Thank you so much, Lori, because that is exactly the message that somebody needs to hear right now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, everyone who's listening. Thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to catching up again soon. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.